So we are very pleased, very honored to have all of our legislative leaders here this afternoon to talk about the session and kind of how they see things as shaking out. And so starting with the Senate Majority Leader, we have Representative Paul Gazelka, who represents a district in central Minnesota, several CGMC cities, including Little Falls, Wadena, Staples, places like that. Next to him we have Senator Tom Bach, Minority Leader, former Majority Leader, good friend of the coalition for a long, long time. Again, represents several of our members on the range. And then Speaker Dowd. Speaker for, is this your second biennium as Speaker? Yeah. Second biennium as Speaker, representing district in the east central part of the state. And again, Representative Hortman, the Minority Leader, will be with us shortly. There's a couple of microphones there. It sounds like you guys have elected to stand, which is fine. You can kind of do it however you want. And so we'll go that way. But I think one of the things that we talked about as we started our briefing this morning was everything that's going on at the legislature and what some of the unresolved issues were. We talked about the positive resolution on the legislative funding, and that now we can sort of move forward and that there's certainty around that. But one of the unresolved issues is who is the lieutenant governor? Who is the senator from Haynesville? What's going to happen there? This does seem to be a constitutional issue that does need to get sorted out. And so I guess maybe I'll start with our two senators.
I want to jump in on the lieutenant governor question.
Yes.
Because tonight, she has to choose her date. She either has to sit by the governor or by me.
Oh yeah.
So you'll see whether she's the Senate president or the lieutenant governor. There's two different chairs up there at the front when the governor's giving his state of the state. So
that'll be fun.
I'm hoping she picks me, but I don't know.
I'll tell you where she's going to sit.
So I think the near-term question is there going to be some sort of clear resolution? Do we think here in the near term on this question? And is it something that we do need to sort of sort out, whether it's with Senator Fischbach's particular situation or just some clarity for the state of Minnesota going forward for the next time that this happens? Senator Gazelka?
Well, if we do it like it's happened 9 other times, and 7 of those times where the senator that became the lieutenant governor, acting lieutenant governor, did both and voted 4 times, and if we just follow that pattern, then we don't need to make any changes. And in fairness, the Constitution did change in '72, I believe it was. And so nobody really knows for sure, but if there was the case where she couldn't do both and the courts ruled that, if it went to the Supreme Court, then we absolutely would have to change how we do things. But it clearly isn't clear. We make a case that we think is right, but I've heard Senator Bach make a case that I think you can at least say is as plausible to happen. So none of that may happen at all. I mean, it really depends on what happens through session. If we get to next year, it was a short period. The governor is not going to be the governor next year, and we'll have a new lieutenant governor. So that's my perspective. Senator Bach, do you know more about the...
I might know more, but I'm not going to share it today. Let me just say, I do think it needs to be resolved because since the Constitution was changed in 1972, the Lieutenant Governor prior to that, the Lieutenant Governor was the presiding officer of the Senate. And in '72, the Constitution was changed. They no longer have any duties in the Senate. But I just kind of jokingly said to Senator Hayden from Minneapolis the other day, because his House member is retired. I said, well, Jeff, why don't you go to your convention and tell him you're going to run for the House? You can stay in the Senate, right? If you can hold 2 elected positions, why couldn't he be a member of the House and a member of the Senate? And the truth is, in the House rules, they don't even have to vote for themselves. So you wouldn't have to vote for someone else could vote for them, and you could be in both places. But that sounds silly, but if you're going to allow people to hold 2 elected positions, I just think we need to resolve that, or we're going to face something like that someday. And I told him, I said, I'd collect both paychecks as long as you're doing that. I'm a good Iron Ranger. Follow the money. But I do think kind of clear the air for next time this happens. It probably has to get resolved, and it might not, because the Supreme Court is very tepid about weighing into disputes in the legislature. You saw that with the legislative budget. I think we all were surprised that they kind of punted that issue. They might find a way to punt this one too, to be able to avoid having to rile any feathers of the legislature, because the truth is the legislature has their budget, right?
Yeah.
So they're kind of always kind of tepid about weighing in.
All right. Do you want to weigh in on this
Just
question?
very quickly, I think they're right. I mean, the current situation probably isn't ideal. Nobody really planned for this, but in reality, the Senate President is next in line after the Lieutenant Governor in the line of succession. So if something happens to the Governor, the Lieutenant Governor will become Governor if there is no Lieutenant Governor. So the one thing that is constant is the Lieutenant Governor had no duties before 1972, and the Lieutenant Governor has no duties now. So we might as well have the Senate President just fill that role in the meantime, and if something happens to the Governor, she can just ascend to Governor.
One last comment. So if it moves the direction that Senator Bach says, and if it went to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court ruled that she couldn't do both, she would resign from Lieutenant Governor, but she'd have to rerun for her seat that she's presently in, because she wants to be a senator. That's what she was elected to do, but the Constitution pointed her to acting Lieutenant Governor. So it's really a unique situation. I'm not real interested in going to the Supreme Court 2 times in 2 years, but it may happen.
All right.
So we may, I was thinking what could happen tonight when the Sergeant at Arms announces, Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to announce the arrival of the Lieutenant Governor. And the Speaker looks and sees sitting next to him, and then they look down at the Supreme Court judges and say, okay, you guys, where are we, right? I expect they're probably going to modify
Yeah, the sergeant works for me, so.
They're probably going to modify how the agenda normally works, but that's normally what
If I had my way, you'd work for me too. But.
All right. Speaking of the work that needs to get done this legislative session, so part of our briefing too, we talked about just the amazing volume of issues even before you put ours on the table that the legislature is going to contend with. It's MNLARS, it's elder care, it's opioids, it's the federal tax changes. There's a whole bunch of things going on. For you and for your caucuses, maybe we'll start with Speaker Dowd. What is your highest priority this legislative session?
Thank you, and thank you for coming to the Capitol, and thank you for inviting us to be here. Our number one priority is the federal tax conformity, but there's a lot of, and you mentioned a lot of them, the issues that are really important to Minnesotans. I think we're going to talk about school safety. I think we're going to talk about opioids and trying to solve that crisis. We still aren't out of the woods on the health insurance crisis, so there are a lot of big problems that need solving, and as I look at those problems, none of them look partisan. None of them look like something where we're going to have ideological corners that we're going to be, trying to stay into. So I actually am very optimistic that we can get some of that stuff solved. I don't know what's going to happen if we don't have a majority in the Senate, but literally no majority. It would be tough to pass bills, but yeah. It wouldn't if you worked for me. No, but in reality, I think, if we could get out of it, and we will pass a bonding bill, I think it probably won't be as big as the governor wants, but we are under the confines of a February forecast that is a little lower than I think we all anticipated. At the chamber dinner, the 4 leaders were there, and we all kind of guessed what we thought the forecast would be, and I was the lowest one at $600 million. And while we had an awesome turnaround from a $188 million deficit in November to a $329 million surplus now, and actually, if you net out the legislative funding, that was a $600 million turnaround in revenue in 3 months. We think it's pessimistic because if you look at the money that's already in the bank, and by the way, 2 days ago we had the actual numbers from February come in and we're $32 million ahead of what they predicted in the February forecast, so that's already outdated. We have $500 million, actually 495 to be exact, in the bank of surplus already this biennium. Right now, that's what's in the bank. We've already collected it. But somehow between now and the end of the biennium, we're only going to have $329 million and $250 million in the tails. in the next biennium. So those constraints make it very difficult to do a lot of spending. And I know Senator Bach and I have been at a lot of these events, and I've listened to him very carefully, that he thought we spent too much last session. So I'm going to listen carefully today to see if he wants to spend more money this session. See if he'll be consistent, because we don't have a lot of money to spend. So we'll see.
Senator Bach?
Well, my advice to my friend the speaker is tell people there's no money. Because the challenge at the legislature, whether you're a Republican leader or a Democratic leader, as soon as you have money, everyone comes to you and wants some. And guess what? Everybody's thing is the most important. And that's how we get into a situation of getting a really, going from a $1.2 billion surplus or so a year ago to a pretty razor thin for surplus in the next biennium. So I guess the number one thing for me is probably would be to make sure we maintain the fiscal integrity of the state, and cities certainly understand that. They remember what happened in 2003 when Governor Plenty came in and we had a sizable surplus. I mean, things like aid to cities is one of the things the legislature can take away. You've seen it happen when there's not enough money. So I do think finding a way to hand off to the next governor and the next legislature a balanced budget that's not in the red, even if it's a skinny amount in the black, as long as it's not in the red, we'll tighten up our belts for the next biennium. But I really hope we can avoid putting us in a situation where we're here this time next year facing some kind of a deficit we have to manage.
Senator Giselka?
Yeah, just kind of adding to some of the things you've heard. As far as local government aid, you all know we increased to $10 million last session, and I have no plans, and we're going to be here for 2.5 years, no plans to take any of that away. In addition to the tax bill, which is probably the most complex thing that we have to do, that will take bipartisan effort, and min-lars, which we have to fix. The government takes responsibility, but in the end, we got to fix it. So we're working on that. All three of us have been talking about it. It's complex, but we're going to get that one done. One that we didn't mention, I think is worth at least talking about, is we're kicking around whether or not we should do the constitutional amendment for sales tax on auto parts to go to roads and bridges. I'm game for that, as long as we take a Senator Bach idea, and that is that we have some focus on towns under 5,000, that they actually are not forgotten. So we'll see where that one goes, but those are a number of the things. The opiates we're going to look at. Safe and secure schools, whether we have money or not money, there are ways that we can provide resources. We came out right away, Senate Republicans, this is what we should be doing. But the governor came out, the House has come out. We're all in agreement on that issue, as long as we focus on safe and secure schools, as long as we focus on mental health. If we get into the gun issue, either side of it, my prediction is nothing happens. So let's focus on what we can do.
So since Senator Giselka brought it up, I was going to ask about it later, but I'll ask about it now. Potential constitutional amendment for transportation. One of the things that we talked about this morning, and I think as most of you gentlemen know, our group has historically looked pretty askance at things like that. But we do think that there might be an opportunity here for the city streets piece of it. But how likely do we think that is? I mean, there was some discussion of constitutional amendment, or we had a round of constitutional amendments 4 or 5 years ago. Is that something that you're either, you used the word, I think, open to? What kind of momentum do you think that particular issue has? We can then go on down the line.
I'll just finish then. I'm actually more than open to, I'm for, but it can't be because I want it. In other words, if there's enough driving force, then I'm supporting it. So I am for it, but everybody's going to have to make the case that it's worthwhile. You all know that if we dedicate that money, then the other piece of the pie becomes a little more complex, HHS, K-12, DNR, higher ed, but particularly K-12 and HHS, normally they're the ones that always seem to get the money and roads and bridges don't, which is why I'm for it.
Senator Bach?
Well, I kind of historically have not liked constitutional amendments as it comes to spending because it takes a lot of authority away from the legislature. It puts whatever you put in the Constitution at the head of the line, more important than anything else. And some kind of event could happen in Minnesota today that we need to respond to. And it's hard for legislators to respond if you've locked away big pots of general fund money in the Constitution and you don't have the flexibility. Now, having said that, we've been unable to get a gas tax passed that is dedicated to transportation. and we can't sit around indefinitely and continue to do nothing. So it is something I think that we'll probably have a good bipartisan conversation about. I think it got made a little harder when the budget forecast came out and it only showed $313 million available in the next biennium. It got a little harder because some of that 313 is going to get spent this year. I mean, if we, for example, if we fix the state's underfunded pension liabilities that we have, that costs about $114 million in the next biennium, the bill that's moving through. So there, over a third of next year's surplus is gone already. So it's just a little harder with such a skinny surplus going into the next biennium. But it is, it's worth a good conversation, and I do think it is a bipartisan issue. The question is just, to what extent do we tie the hands of future legislators when we know money's a little tight? It might fit better on the ballot in 20 or in 22, and we can get through this next budget cycle. But right now, it looks a little difficult. And I'm not saying I wouldn't vote for it even, but I think it merits a good conversation about where are we going to be this time next year, because the Senate will be here. Paul and I think will still be here. The Speaker may get beat. You may be out there in your chairs next year. It doesn't start behaving.
Speaker Dowd, there's a lot there to respond to.
Yes, there is. By the way, Tom and I are actually very good friends, and we do this a lot together, so we like to poke a little fun at each other. As far as the constitutional amendment, my hope was that we were going to have $1 billion surplus, and I think all the indicators were there. And if we had that, I was going to actually statutorily dedicate the other half of that auto part sales tax to roads and bridges this session, and then put it on the ballot. It becomes a little more difficult with the constraints of that forecast and the tails, but it is our hope to do that. And it wasn't actually Senator Bach's idea to give cities under 5,000 money for roads and bridges. That was a House Republican idea from 15 and 16, and we fought darn hard to make sure you got that money. So I'm glad that you have some, and we want to give you more. But I love how there's been a revision of history. That was in our House bill, and we brought that idea forward and ended up passing it into law. They forget we exist, but. Go ahead, Senator
They're so
Bach.
unruly over there. Nobody has suggested we put something in the Constitution to help cities under 5,000. In the Constitution, right? Because cities over 5,000 get some of the gas tax money, but cities under don't. That was Tom Bach's idea. In the Constitution. I'll give them the statutory language, okay? We did that, and I actually voted for that bill that gave small cities some money. But I do think if we go forward with this, I do think it's a very good idea that we help small cities out too. I think it'll help a great deal with the passage of it also.
All right, thanks. We're happy to be joined by Representative Hortman, the minority leader of the Democrats in the House. Welcome. We're very glad you're here. We've been talking a little bit about sort of what the priorities for each legislative caucus might be. We talked a little bit about the potential of a constitutional amendment on transportation. Maybe if you want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what you think the priorities for the this legislative session should be, and then we can move on with some other topics.
Good afternoon. I think the highest priority should be the biggest bonding bill possible. I think that we know that a $1.5 billion bonding bill has 32,000 jobs. We know that in Minnesota we're at basically full employment. We have excellent economic figures, but the kids that I represent in the Osseo School District and the kids that I represent in the Anoka-Hennepin School District, their families are worse and worse off every year. We've got more and more kids on free and reduced lunch than we've ever had before. And why is that? If we're at a full employment economy and the economy is doing great, the reason is people are underemployed. They don't have jobs that can support a middle-class family with the middle-class standard of living that we all think every family deserves. And in the bonding bill, we have the opportunity to create 32,000 good-paying jobs for Minnesota families. So that is my highest priority. Second highest priority is getting the tax bill done this year while we're in session, in regular session, if at all possible. I know it's going to be very complicated, and those idiots in Washington, D.C. haven't finished fixing their mistakes yet, so that makes it even harder for us. But I think we need a tax conformity bill that is weighted in favor of Minnesota's working families. I think the Minnesota working families who don't have 3 Suburbans and 2 Jaguars and 3 vacation homes need to get more in tax cuts than people who do have 3 Suburbans and 2 Jaguars and 3 vacation homes. So those would be my highest priorities for this session.
All right. The bonding bill was actually going to be my next question, so that was a good segue, and maybe we'll pick up with Speaker Dowd. I think you had mentioned actually a bonding bill, probably not $1 billion. Obviously, for our group, we're looking at heavy on infrastructure, wastewater treatment. We're supporting the $167 million for the various PFA programs. From your perspective, how big should the bonding bill be, and what should be the priorities within it?
Everything you just said are our priorities, and I think you saw the bill that we passed last year was the largest bonding bill in state history, and it had more of those things than any other, by percentage, than any other bill in history. So my members love when we invest in infrastructure, roads and bridges, water, that sort of stuff. So I would look for that to be a big component of a bonding bill. And overall bonding bill size, we just have to be realistic. If we do anything more than $800 million, we have to budget for the debt service on that. And you heard Senator Tom Bach just say that we don't have any money. And it becomes very difficult to start doing that. And it's not just that, he's saying that for a reason. We've got MNLARS, which, they want $43 million this biennium, $29 million in the next, to fix a system that, by the way, you've already paid for about 3 times what you should have paid for it. And now they want you to pay for it 2 or 3 more times again. And at the end of that, they cannot guarantee that they will have a system that works. You ought to be very mad about this, because if you ask yourself, why isn't there more money for roads and bridges? Why isn't there more money for schools? It's mismanagement just like this in MNLARS. $93 million to write their own computer system when they could have used a commercially available solution, okay? $93 million, and it doesn't work. And now they want, I don't even know how much more, 60, 70 million more over the next 3 years to fix something that they assured us would work. That's one example. The pensions, I don't even know how much that is in the current biennium. 50, 27, and then it's 130 in the tails, and 130 every 2 years for the next 20 years, ever. This is like a $3 or $4 billion bill. We look at where the money went to this biennium, from last to this. 10% increase, a 9% increase in overall spending, actually about 8. But 5% of that on one line item, medical assistance. Since this governor became governor 7 years ago, we have almost tripled the number of Minnesotans on medical assistance. And in case you're wondering in your head, gosh, I don't see 3 times more wheelchairs rolling around. I don't see, that's right. We've put able-bodied Minnesotans onto public programs. And that is eating our state budget. So if you're wondering where the money is that's not going into LGA or roads and bridges or all the other things that you think are important, start looking around at where the money is going and start asking questions, and let's together start holding people accountable so that there can be more money for the things that we all stand here and say are our shared priorities. And that's the sort of thing it's going to take to get situations like MNLARS, so people will hold themselves accountable for that. The governor says he's responsible, but yet he's not willing to find the money to fix the problem or even guarantee that it can be fixed. It's time that we start to hold people accountable.
Senator Bach, bonding bill, how big, what should the priority be?
I have floated an idea, and everybody up here knows it, that I think people should seriously consider. We do have kind of this arbitrary cap. No one wants to break the ceiling of $1 billion, because where does it stop once you go there, right? So what I have said is, let's do just a traditional bonding bill, and let's just all bipartisanly agree as Minnesotans, let's fix all of our stuff that's worn out. Roads, bridges, wastewater infrastructure. DNR alone, owns more real estate than anybody in the state, right? They got about a $400 million backlog of state buildings that need windows and roofs and siding and painting and trails that are eroded. They're at Minskew and at the University of Minnesota, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of work that needs to get done. And the challenge of fitting that into the constraints of a $1 billion bill is members have stuff on behalf of their communities. And it's new, shiny stuff that writes better campaign literature than pointing a building or putting a roof on a building or getting some money for a wastewater plant, right? So that kind of deferred maintenance stuff always is where gets shrunk down as we try to put a bill together that we can constitutionally get 60% of the members to vote for. So I would just like to take the politics out of this deferred maintenance, and let's all agree that the Minnesota thing would be to fix the stuff we currently have that's falling apart. And I think Minnesotans would agree. And let's just do a separate bill for infrastructure, pick a number, and it'll take a lot of pressure off the traditional bonding bill that we're going to do.
Senator Kazaka.
So I don't expect too many new shiny things because we do need to take care of our roads and bridges, our wastewater infrastructure. We're talking about, what do we do, making sure that those are taken care of. I think it'll be around 800 million. Just as we look to go to a higher number and try to fit that into what we have available, it makes it really, really hard. We went through the lesson in our side. What can we do with the money of that 300 plus million? That's a surplus. Well, about 100 million of it, a little more, is going to go into reserves, and that's going to put that the cash flow account and reserve account. I think that'll push it above $2 billion, the two combined. So it doesn't leave a whole lot left, and so that's where we have to figure out what we're going to do. We have talked about pensions as being important. I don't want to do it, but in the end, if we don't do it, it only gets worse. MNLARS is another one. What are we going to do about safe and secure schools? So that's why I'm real careful to commit to more than 800 million, because if we go above that, then something else is going to have to give.
All right, so we had some reference to the budget forecast in our early part of the discussion, that maybe it wasn't necessarily as big as folks had maybe guessed it might be. Minnesota Management Budget, when they put out the forecast, said that the fundamentals of Minnesota's economy are strong, and they cited low unemployment, the fund balances, and kind of the overall tenor of the economy. Do you guys generally agree with the assessment that Minnesota's economy has strong fundamentals, or are there dark clouds that we should be looking for on the horizon? And we'll start with Gazelka and then go.
Yeah, both Minnesota and federally has very strong fundamentals. And even in the report, it said that the tax breaks are working, that it's producing optimism and growth. And every indicator we're looking at is very positive, which is why we were disappointed in the February forecast. We looked at a few of the numbers. What they used for GDP seemed way low compared to what GDP actually has been. And even, for example, 2019, in November, they showed corporate profits at 5.5%, and by February they said that same number was 1.5%. And I asked, well, why did you pick that number? Well, the only answer they could give was their consultant said so. So I don't know. And then we see the next first month of numbers that come after that report was another 32 million, and you go, I think we're going to be better off. But because we follow the February forecast, we're stuck. There's not a lot of things we can do, and that's just the way it is.
Sarah Bach?
Well, I think we're probably in a period where we've got, I would describe it as kind of anemic growth at about 2% GDP. That's probably not going to change much. And part of the reason is, we have more job vacancies right now than we have people looking for work. So how do you stimulate an economy and get businesses to hire when there's no one to hire? So I think we're probably in that period. The days of coming out of recessions and having pretty rapid growth of 3, 4, 5%, I think are probably behind us as a country. And we're a more mature economy now, and I think one of the driving factors, the reason we're never going to see really significant growth coming out of recessions is it used to be when we came out of a recession, people felt a little better about their personal finances, and they went out and bought things. They maybe went out and bought new appliances, they bought new carpet, or they bought new draperies, or maybe they bought a car. And the economy right away picked up when people felt better and consumers spent more. Well, now when consumers feel better, it isn't people in America that go to work to build the furniture anymore or to build the new appliances, it's people in Mexico. or people in China. And it's their economies that are stimulated when consumer spending improves in our country. So just the maturity of our economy, I think it's going to be very difficult to see growth at much more than 2% going forward. So that means, you know, revenue's probably not going to grow like it used to when you come out of recessions. And we've certainly seen that since 2009. We haven't seen much more than 2% growth, and it's been amazing recovery. And if you got money in the stock market, it's been spectacular since 2009. But still, GDP growth has been hovering in that 2% range, and that's probably where we're going to be going forward. So not a lot of significant growth in state revenue because you won't have significant growth in GDP.
Speak it up.
I do think the economy is doing well. If you look at all of the indicators in the forecast, they're predicting higher wage growth, higher job growth, higher economic growth, higher consumer spending, all things that should point to more revenue coming into the state of Minnesota. So that's why the number itself was a little confusing. They literally think we're going to lose $165 million worth of revenue between now and the end of the year, or excuse me, the end of the biennium, which is 15 or 16 months away. And I get their job's really tough. You know, we always think our jobs are tough, but they have to predict how much money is going to come in. And then give us that number so we can actually commit it to other things before it comes in. They have to be cautious, but we just think they're being a bit overcautious in this one. But all of the signs for economic growth are good, and it doesn't appear that there's any storm clouds on the horizon. So I think folks are doing well. I think, you know, the feedback that we're hearing from our districts is folks are starting to feel like they're doing a little bit better. And you know, the good news is, why do we have a surplus? Because the federal government cut taxes. And it's a great lesson that you can actually reduce taxes and the state can see more revenue come in. It creates more economic activity and you can actually see more revenue come into the state. So it's, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better textbook case of what just happened, because nothing else happened between November of last year and February of this year. The federal government put a bunch of money into the economy, spurred economic growth, and we actually are predicting higher revenue because of that. And if you don't think that's the case, look at the assumptions they made in the November forecast. At that time, they predicted that the federal government was not going to pass a bill. They lowered the economic growth number, and that literally created the deficit that we had. Well, they weren't right to their prediction. A week later, they passed that tax relief, and now they've had to raise the economic growth back up to 2.7%. So, you know, and to one of the earlier points, you know, people would be out spending their money on, you know, new whatever, cars or whatever, consumer spending, but we still have some problems that Minnesotans face that we have to solve, that the legislature put on them. You know, we have Minnesotans that are still paying $3,000 a month for their insurance premiums with a $13,000 deductible. And that's not uncommon, by the way, and there's still 125,000 people, I think, left in the individual marketplace. By the way, it was supposed to be like 500,000 right now, but there's 125 million left in there. It might be depleting a little bit now as people find other places to get more reasonable insurance, but that's the numbers those people are paying. They don't have extra money. They're paying 2 or 3 times their mortgage to get health insurance. We have to fix that problem.
Representative Portman, your assessment of the economy.
So looking out into the future, the economists tell us that there are storm clouds on the horizon. Those storm clouds come in the form of inflation. And when you look at the Trump tax cut from this December, and then now the potential for a trade war that's starting, he's following the Nixon playbook. So when Nixon came into office, he did a gigantic tax cut in 1969. Then he started imposing tariffs, and a trade war ensued. And we know in the 1970s what we saw from overjuicing the economy and then causing the trade war, that we saw double-digit inflation. So we ignore history at our peril. We used to not have a Council of Economic Advisors after the Depression. We got a Council of Economic Advisors. And they're very good at seeing when we overjuice the economy, we have to pay the piper. And the problem with the Trump tax cuts is they are deficit financed. So that bill will come due. So we absolutely have to be cautious looking into the future. It's great that the economy is good right now, but anybody who was alive in the early 1980s or the late 1970s knows that double-digit inflation is not good for economic growth. It's not good for families who want to take out mortgages and who want to get loans to buy cars. So we have to think about that. The other storm cloud on the horizon is we're all getting older. And about the dumbest thing we can do for our projected increases in future healthcare costs is kick a bunch of people off of medical assistance, Minnesota Care, and Minnesota medical assistants. I have a close member of my family just diagnosed with liver disease. This individual in their mid-40s now has a 15 to 20 year life expectancy. Do we want this person to be on a drug that can make it less likely they need a liver transplant? And when that person needs a liver transplant, do we want that to be paid for by a rural hospital who's got uncompensated care that never gets paid back? Or do we want that to be paid by a state subsidized insurance plan? So we can talk about kicking people off medical assistance, but the costs for their care don't go away. They just come in a different place. They'll come on your insurance bill, or they'll come on your rural hospital not getting compensated for the care that they're delivering. So it sounds good to cut government, but when we're all just going to pay for it somewhere else, it doesn't actually accomplish anything. So on that happy note, I think it's great we have a $329 surplus, but we do have to be careful in the out years.
All right, we are getting close to 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We've asked you to play constitutional law professor. We've asked you to play economist. We've had you play historian. Now I would like you to play career counselor. And all of you have dealt with governors. You've all been around politics for a long time. When we gather here next year, we will have a new governor of the state of Minnesota. And so having dealt with governors, having been around politics, what is your advice for the next governor of the state of Minnesota? And we'll start with Representative Horton.
Well, I think we have to pay attention to the fundamentals that have made Minnesota great. You know, we used to be number 1 or 2 in K-12 education quality and success around the country. We're now number 22 because we started coasting, and other states were pedaling as fast as they could to catch up, and they have now passed us by. So I would say to Minnesota's next governor, Minnesota's a cold place. We're not going to have a migration in. As people get older, they don't want to live in colder weather. So we won't be able to attract the best and the brightest and keep citizens unless we have a thriving economy. And we should keep what's always been great about Minnesota, which is our incredibly bright workforce that created companies like 3M. So I would say get back to investing in what made Minnesota great, K-12 education and higher education.
Advice for the next governor, Speaker Dow?
You know, I think I don't necessarily disagree with what Melissa Hortman said, which is paining me to say, but I'm teasing. You know, but I think also we are reaching a threshold. I mean, her point about seniors aren't, you know, I kind of joke often about we can't rely on our weather to keep seniors here anymore, right? I mean, in Florida, they have 0 income tax. They have, you know, they don't have to pay any tax on their Social Security income. We're literally paying people to leave this state. And there is one, my Ways and Means chair reminds me of this frequently, there is one way that the forecast could be right. That we could have a $500 million surplus today, and we'll be down at 329 at the end of the biennium, with job growth, wage growth, all those things, if people actually are leaving the state. That's the way. So, you know, the governor keeps telling us that people aren't going to, but to make this state great, we've got to be competitive. And in a day and age when people can work from anywhere, from their laptop, people are going to migrate, and we are seeing that. We're seeing companies leave. I have a friend that sold a large company that the number, had they paid the tax in this state, it would have showed up in our forecast. It was that big of a company. And they didn't. The entire family moved their residency out of the state, and this state lost, on the low end, $100 million of revenue. So those are the things you have to think about. We need to be competitive, and we need to keep people here. And so my advice would be, let's make Minnesota competitive. Let's not make it an outlier. We're the 4th highest tax state in the country. Let's be competitive.
Advice to the next governor.
Well, I have a prediction. His first name's probably going to be Tim. He's probably not going to have much money to spend, so I would agree with Melissa. It is our workforce that has made us very great as a state, as an economy, as a quality of life. And that's why these Fortune 500 companies are here, because they've had an incredible workforce. And we've invented some amazing things that have changed the world here, Minnesotans have. And with the number of baby boomers kind of moving off into retirement, I'm one of them, Paul's almost one of them, these big companies and the entire vendor community that services them are going to have to replace these people. We have very innovative companies, and they are going to have to find this next generation of Minnesotans to continue to do the great work that's been done so the business community can be successful. And so I guess my first advice to the next governor is, to the extent you can, continue to invest in the future of Minnesota's workforce. I think that's going to pay the largest benefit to the state.
All right, Senator Gazelka.
Paint a positive, accurate vision of the future. People want hope. Just point it in a way that it truly is reality. Don't be afraid to reform. We have a number of things that are killing both government, local government, business owners, etc., and regulations that drive people nuts. Don't be afraid to reform that kind of stuff. That has put a real damper on many, many, many things in Minnesota. But mostly paint a vision that's accurate about what we can be, where we can go, and people will follow it.
All right, well, again, thank you to the four of you for being here. It's a great honor to have all of our caucus leaders here. We really appreciate the work that you do. You've all been very open to seeing us and our people. Good luck with the rest of the session. Can't wait to see what the seating arrangement is for this evening, the state of the state. And thank you so much for being here. Give them a hand, please.